Chess is a game of endless intrigue, blending logic, creativity, and discipline on a simple checkered board. For those beginning their journey, mastering chess can seem daunting, but every grandmaster once started with the same curiosity and uncertainty. At its heart, chess is a dialogue, a silent conversation between two minds, each move expressing intent, caution, or ambition. The board itself is unchanging, yet the possibilities that unfold with every new game are limitless. Each piece carries its own strengths and limitations, and understanding their unique roles is the first step in learning how to guide them across the landscape of the 64 squares. As you settle in to absorb the foundations of chess strategy, it is helpful to think of the game as a living puzzle. Patterns form and dissolve, plans emerge, and the balance between offense and defense shifts with every decision. The opening moves serve not only to stake a claim on the board, but also to set the tone for what follows, gradually revealing the deeper layers of tactics and positional play. The aim is not simply to memorize moves, but to cultivate an awareness of patterns, to sense the ebb and flow of the contest, and to anticipate the subtle intentions behind each action. Let your mind slow as you imagine the gentle rhythm of the game, each piece finding its place with quiet assurance. The challenge is not to rush toward victory, but to appreciate the unfolding complexity, to learn from each encounter, and to recognize how even the smallest adjustment can tip the balance. With patience and curiosity, the fundamental ideas of chess will become familiar companions, guiding you through the intricacies of the game. As you listen and reflect, allow the principles of strategic mastery to settle in, gently preparing you for thoughtful exploration and steady growth on your path to chess improvement. Chapter 1. The Chessboard Battlefield. Imagine the chessboard as a quiet field before dawn, each square inviting possibility. There are 64 squares, arranged in a perfect grid, 8 across and 8 down. Each player sits with a white square at their right hand. The board is marked by lines running across, down, and at angles. These lines shape every move and every plan. The horizontal lines are called ranks. They are numbered from 1 to 8, moving away from each player. The vertical lines are called files. They are labeled from A to H, left to right. These ranks and files form the grid that shapes all movement. Then there are diagonals. These are lines that run at a gentle angle, linking squares of the same color. Diagonals stretch from corner to corner, ranging from just a few squares to nearly the full width of the board. The diagonals matter most for certain pieces, but their presence gives the board its unique texture. At the heart of the board, 4 squares meet to form the center. This center acts as a crossroads, where control often means greater freedom for your pieces. The lines of the board create a map, one that guides each decision and shapes the flow of the game. As your eyes move across the board, you see pieces lined up and ready. Each piece moves differently, and each carries its own strengths and limits. The pawns stand in a row at the front. They move forward 1 square at a time, though on their first step, they may move forward 2. Pawns are the only pieces that capture at an angle, 1 square forward and to the side. They cannot move backward, which gives them a sense of steady progress and commitment. Behind the pawns, the knights wait in their corners. Knights move in an L shape, 2 squares in one direction and 1 at a right angle. They can hop over other pieces, making them unpredictable and useful for surprising moves. Next to the knights are the bishops. Bishops slide diagonally, as far as they can go without jumping other pieces. Each bishop is tied to either the light or dark squares, never crossing over. This makes their influence stretch along long, clear paths, but only on one color. Rooks stand at the very edges. Rooks move straight along ranks or files, as far as the board allows. They cannot jump over pieces, but their reach is powerful once the board opens up. The queen starts on the central file, always placed on her own color. She combines the power of the rook and bishop, moving straight or diagonally for any distance. The queen's flexibility gives her the widest range of movement. The king stands next to the queen. The king moves only one square at a time, in any direction. His safety is the focus of the game, so his steps are measured and careful. Each piece interacts with the board in a different way, and understanding these patterns is the first step toward making thoughtful choices. As the game begins, the opening phase unfolds. This is not just a matter of moving pieces at random. The opening is about setting the stage for the entire battle. The first goal is often to claim the center, using pawns to stake a claim and open lines for the other pieces. When you move a pawn forward from in front of your king or queen, you start to control the center. This makes space for your knights and bishops to enter the game. Knights often come out early, aiming for squares near the center where they can reach more of the board. Bishops look for open diagonals, where their influence can stretch across the field. As you move these pieces into position, you begin to connect your forces. Soon you may find a moment to castle. This special move tucks your king behind a wall of pawns and brings a rook closer to the center. Castling is both a defensive and a connecting move, linking your pieces together for greater strength. Each step in the opening is guided by the desire to control space, to keep your king safe, and to prepare your army for the battles that will come. Seeing the board as a field of possibilities, and each piece as a tool with its own strengths, shapes every decision you make. When you focus on placement and coordination in the opening, you create the conditions for later tactics to succeed. Chess rewards those who look beyond the first move and think about what each step sets in motion. The board's lines become pathways, and the pieces become travelers, each with a purpose. This way of thinking brings clarity and calm to the game, making it easier to read the flow of play and anticipate what comes next. The chessboard, at first glance a simple grid, becomes a landscape of strategy and foresight. Chapter 2: Opening Moves. Setting the stage. From the very first move in chess, the shape of the game begins to form. The opening is not just a routine or a set of memorized moves. It is the moment when each piece starts to claim space, and the intentions of both players quietly unfold. The way you approach these first moves sets the tone for everything that follows. The opening is about three things: establishing a foothold in the most important part of the board, developing your pieces to active squares, and keeping your king safe. Each of these principles shapes how the rest of the game unfolds. Controlling the center is the first principle to hold in mind. When you place your pawns and pieces toward those central squares, you give them greater reach and flexibility. Pieces posted there can support attacks, defend key points, and shift to either side of the board as needed. This means you are not just reacting to your opponent, but setting the pace and direction of play. Moving a pawn to the center at the start opens paths for your bishops and queen, while making it harder for your opponent to create threats of their own. Efficient development is the next principle. The focus should be on the knights and bishops, which come out quickly and can control important lines and diagonals. Moving each piece once to a good square is usually better than moving the same piece several times. Every extra move spent on one piece is a move not spent on another, and that gap can leave you behind. The queen, though powerful, is best left in reserve during the early moves. Bringing it out too soon can invite attacks and force you to retreat, losing valuable time. King safety is the final principle of the opening. The king is most exposed at the start of the game, sitting in the center of the board. Early threats may not be common, but leaving the king unprotected can make you vulnerable to sudden attacks. Castling is the main way to address this. It completes two tasks at once. The king steps out of danger, and a rook moves closer to the center. The king steps out of danger, and the rook becomes ready to support the rest of your pieces. Moving too many pawns or delaying castling can create weaknesses and make it harder to defend against threats later. A common mistake in the opening is to make moves without a clear purpose. Random pawn pushes or chasing after early material gains can leave your position uncoordinated and fragile. Instead of trying to win material right away or rush into attacks, focus on building a foundation. Each move should help you gain control of the center, develop a new piece, or improve your king's safety. There is no need to memorize specific move sequences at this stage. The important thing is to understand these core ideas and let them guide your decisions. When you play with purpose, each piece finds its role more naturally, and your position becomes stronger with each step. Many openings have been studied and named, each with its own character and goals. You may hear names like the Ruy Lopez, the Sicilian Defense, or the Queen's Gambit. Each of these is a well-known way to begin a chess game, and each reflects a different approach to the principles just discussed. Understanding what drives these openings can help you see the logic behind them, rather than just memorizing moves. The Ruy Lopez is one of the oldest and most studied openings. In this setup, White's bishop targets a knight that helps defend the central pawn. By doing so, White applies gentle pressure to the center and sets up the possibility of long-term advantages. The Ruy Lopez is not about quick attacks, but about building control and flexibility. It often leads to positions where both sides have many options, and the game can develop in several directions. The Sicilian Defense is another popular choice, often played in response to White's first move. It takes a different path, by challenging the center with a pawn from the side rather than the front. This creates an uneven structure and gives black chances for counterplay, especially on the queen side. The Sicilian is known for its dynamic positions, where both players must pay close attention to the changing balance of power. The opening does not aim for symmetry or safety, but for activity and the chance to seize the initiative. The Queen's Gambit starts with White, offering a pawn to draw Black's central pawn away. The goal is not to lose material, but to tempt Black into giving up control of the center. If Black accepts, White can often regain the pawn, while maintaining pressure on the middle of the board. If Black declines, the game usually settles into a quiet contest for space and piece activity. The Queen's Gambit is valued for its clarity and the opportunities it offers for both sides to show skill in piece placement and planning. Each of these openings is a path to the same goal: to control key squares, develop pieces efficiently, and prepare for the next phase of the game. The choice between them depends on your style and the type of position you find comfortable. What matters most is that you understand the ideas behind each setup. The opening is not a race or a puzzle to be solved, but a way to shape the board so your pieces can work together. As the opening phase unfolds, you may notice the game beginning to shift. The first moves have brought your pieces out. Your king is safer, and the center is contested or held. This is the point where the game naturally transitions toward the mid-game. Now, instead of simply bringing pieces out, you start to look for specific plans. You may see opportunities to attack a weak pawn, occupy an open file, or coordinate your pieces for a future assault. The opening has set the stage, but now the true contest begins. The transition from opening to mid-game is not marked by a single move, but by a change in focus. As development nears completion, attention shifts to the patterns and imbalances that have formed. A solid opening often leaves you with more options and the ability to shape the direction of the game. If you have followed the core principles, your position is likely to be sound, flexible, and ready for new ideas. This foundation is what allows you to take the initiative or defend with confidence as the game moves forward. Momentum in chess often comes from these early choices. A well-played opening can give you the first chance to act, to create threats, or to seize space. It can also protect you from falling into a passive or cramped position. The early moves do not decide the game on their own, but they do make certain plans more likely and others less practical. Being aware of this flow helps you adapt as the situation changes and encourages you to stay alert for new possibilities. Rigidity in the opening can be a subtle trap. Following a set pattern without regard for your opponent's moves can leave you unprepared for the unique shape of each game. The most effective players use opening principles as a guide, not as a script. They adjust as new threats appear and as opportunities arise. This willingness to adapt is what connects the opening to the rest of the game, making your early moves a living part of your overall strategy. Thinking of the opening as the act of setting the stage changes how you approach each move. Instead of chasing short-term gains or playing by rote, you begin to see each piece as part of a larger plan. The early game becomes a way of shaping the possibilities that will unfold. With this mindset, the transition to the mid-game feels less like a leap and more like a natural expansion. The board opens up, and your strategy has room to breathe. The quiet discipline of the opening is what gives rise to creativity and control in the moves that follow. Chapter 3: Control the Center. At the heart of every chess game lies a quiet struggle for the center. The four central squares, d4, e4, d5, and e5, form the crossroads of the board. These squares are not just a meeting point of ranks and files. They are the ground from which a player's pieces reach their greatest potential. To control the center means to shape the course of the game, both for attack and for defense. When pieces stand on or influence these squares, their power radiates outward. They reach across the board, connecting lines and diagonals, watching over both flanks and opening paths for future plans. The reason these squares matter so much is simple. A piece in the center has more choices. It can swing to either side, shift between attack and defense, and coordinate with other pieces more easily. Pawns placed on d4, e4, d5, or e5 do more than occupy space. Each pawn controls two squares at once, blocking the opponent's advance and threatening to push forward. This dual control makes it hard for the opponent to challenge the center without careful preparation. Even a single pawn in the center can open or close lines as the game develops, shifting the balance quietly. Thinking of the center as high ground can help here. Taking a hill in a physical battle gives you wider visibility and reach. The center works the same way. Knights in the center, for example, can jump to more squares than knights on the edge. Bishops and queens too become more flexible when their diagonals cut through the heart of the board. The result is a position where your options expand, while your opponent's choices narrow. This is why so many games are built around the fight for these four squares. Most games begin with moves that claim or challenge the center. Moving the e-pawn or d-pawn forward signals an intent to take part in this fight. The king's pawn opening, starting with e4, is one of the clearest examples. By pushing the pawn to e4, white immediately occupies a central square and opens lines for the queen and bishop. Black often responds with e5, mirroring the idea and meeting the challenge head-on. This creates a balanced tension, where both players have a stake in the center and must decide how to support or undermine it. The queen's pawn opening, beginning with d4, follows the same principle. White's pawn moves to d4, staking a claim to the center and preparing to develop the minor pieces behind it. Black may answer with e5, matching White's control, or choose a different approach. In both openings, the goal is not only to place a pawn in the center, but also to prepare for the safe development of other pieces. Knights often come out next, finding their best squares near the center, where they can influence more of the board. Bishops and queens follow, supporting the central pawns and increasing the pressure. Supporting central pawns with minor pieces is a key part of these strategies. Knights on 3-3 or f3 for white, or c6 or f6 for black, help defend the center while staying ready to move. Bishops on squares like c4 or f4 use their diagonals to reinforce that control. The result is a position where each piece works together, forming a web of influence that is hard to break. These opening moves are common across all levels of play. Early control of the center tends to lead to greater freedom and safer development. Central dominance does not only shape your own options, it also changes the way your opponent can play. When you control more of the center, your opponent's pieces often struggle to find good squares. Their knights may be pushed to the rim, where they have fewer options. Bishops may be blocked by their own pawns, and rooks may sit idle behind crowded lines. This restriction limits your opponent's ability to coordinate attacks or defend key points. It often forces them to play passively, waiting for a chance to break free. This influence over the opponent's mobility leads to a subtle shift in the flow of the game. With the center under your command, you are free to launch attacks on either wing, or shift your pieces quickly to meet threats. The center acts as a launching pad, giving you flexibility and the ability to respond to whatever arises. Your opponent, meanwhile, may find their plans stalling before they begin, as each attempt to expand is met with resistance from your well-placed pieces. Even a small lead in central control can make it difficult for the other side to coordinate their forces or create threats. Central pawns, in particular, become anchors for your position. They hold space, block enemy advances, and support your own pieces. Flank pawns, by contrast, rarely offer the same level of influence. In some situations, giving up a pawn on the side to gain a pawn in the center can be a worthwhile trade. The value of such an exchange depends on the position, but the tendency is clear. The center is where the action happens, and the side that holds it often finds more ways to improve their position. As the game unfolds, the effects of early central control become more noticeable. Pieces squeezed to the edge lose their impact. Coordination suffers, and the player with less space often finds it harder to defend or counterattack. This does not mean that central control guarantees victory, but it does tend to tilt the balance. The player who shapes the center is more likely to steer the game's direction and press for advantages as the complexity increases. Seeing the center as the board's crossroads changes how you evaluate each move. Instead of looking for immediate threats or chasing quick gains, you begin to weigh each decision for its effect on the central struggle. The center becomes a measure of your position's health, a signpost that points toward future plans and possibilities. With this perspective, your choices become more deliberate and your strategy gains clarity. When you focus on the center, the rest of the board starts to make more sense. Each piece finds its purpose, and the flow of the game feels less like chaos and more like a pattern waiting to be understood. Chapter 4: Developing your pieces. In chess, the early moves are about more than simply getting pieces off their starting squares. The act of development means moving your pieces to active places where they can influence the board and support your plans. This is most important in the opening, when both sides are preparing for the deeper battles that follow. The goal is not just to move a piece for the sake of movement, but to bring it out with purpose. When you develop efficiently, your pieces begin to work together, covering key squares and forming the base for future attacks or defenses. A common temptation is to move the same piece multiple times or to focus too much on pushing pawns at the expense of bringing out the knights and bishops. The key idea here is to use each move to increase your reach and readiness, not to shuffle pieces back and forth or fill time with low-impact moves. After placing a pawn in the center, your attention should shift to the minor pieces. Knights and bishops are the first to leave their starting places, as they can quickly reach squares where they influence the center and connect with each other. Moving the same piece twice, without good reason, usually wastes valuable time, called tempo, which could have been used to bring another piece into play. Each tempo spent on a fresh development creates momentum, giving you control over more of the board and making it harder for your opponent to build their own plans. Delaying development, or moving pieces randomly, often leads to a passive position where your opponent can take the initiative. The difference between an active and a passive setup is often determined in these opening moves, where every decision shapes the flow of the game. Proper development does not mean scattering your pieces without coordination. The way you position your knights and bishops is central to how much control you have over the board. Knights are at their strongest when placed toward the center, where they can jump to many squares and protect key points. A knight on the edge has fewer options and less influence. Bishops thrive on open diagonals, where they can reach deep into the opponent's position and work in tandem with other pieces. When these pieces support each other, your formation becomes more solid and flexible. Instead of thinking that all your pieces must be developed at the same pace, focus on how well they coordinate. Sometimes a bishop may wait behind pawns until the right diagonal opens, while a knight may be brought out quickly to reinforce the center. The effectiveness of your mid-game plans often depends on how well your pieces are placed during development. A rook brought to an open file can later control an entire column, while a bishop on a long diagonal can support advances or defend key pawns. Pieces that are close together and support one another create a network that is much harder for your opponent to break. If your pieces are scattered and disconnected, your mid-game ideas become harder to execute, and you may find yourself forced into awkward moves just to keep up. Piece activity in the opening is about more than material count. It is about having options and the ability to respond to new threats or opportunities as they arise. Once your pieces are developed, you reach a state called strategic readiness. This means your army is prepared to shift gears, either pressing forward with an attack or holding back to defend, depending on what the position calls for. Well-developed pieces give you the flexibility to adapt. If your opponent creates a threat, you can respond without leaving your other pieces exposed. If a chance to attack appears, your pieces are already in place to support the effort. Flexibility in development is not about rushing to attack, but about keeping your options open and not locking yourself into a single plan too early. A common mistake is to assume that development always leads straight to a direct attack. In reality, good development creates balance. You are ready to attack if the opportunity comes, but you are also prepared to defend or adjust your plan if the situation changes. Sometimes, committing your pawns to fixed positions too soon can trap your own pieces, making it hard to adapt if the game takes an unexpected turn. Strong players watch for signs that their initial setup is not working, and are willing to adjust the placement of their pieces before the mid-game begins. The mindset you bring to development shapes the rest of your game. When you value readiness and adaptability, you see each move as a way to increase your options rather than close them off. Each piece you develop is like a tool being readied for work, not just a figure to be moved for appearance's sake. As you become more aware of how development patterns influence the flow of play, you start to see the opening as a time to set up not just for one plan, but for many possible futures. This awareness lets you move through the opening with confidence, knowing that your pieces are prepared for whatever comes next. The board becomes a stage for strategy, and your pieces, once developed, give you the freedom to act or react as the game unfolds. Chapter 5: The Art of Castling. Castling is unlike any other move on the board. It lets you move two pieces in a single turn, the king and one of your rooks, but only when a specific set of conditions are met. Understanding those conditions is what separates players who use castling well from those who miss the opportunity or misuse it. The first rule is that neither the king nor the rook chosen for castling can have moved earlier in the game. If either piece has already moved, even just one square, the right to castle on that side is lost for the rest of the game. Next, there must be no pieces between the king and the rook. Every square along the path must be clear. Another requirement is that the king cannot be in check at the moment of castling. In addition, the king must not pass through any square that is under attack by an opponent's piece as it moves toward its final position. Finally, the king cannot end up in a square that is threatened. If any of these conditions are not met, castling is not allowed. This set of rules makes castling feel distinct from other king or rook moves, and new players sometimes confuse a regular king or rook move for castling. But only when all these requirements are satisfied can the move be made. The careful structure of these rules reflects the special nature of castling and the game's concern for both safety and fairness. The reason castling is so valued is that it serves two important strategic goals in a single move. First, it moves your king away from the center, where it is often exposed to attacks, and tucks it behind a wall of pawns. This shift usually places the king on a safer part of the board, making it less vulnerable to threats that arise as pieces are exchanged and the center opens up. The second benefit is that castling brings your rook closer to the center, positioning it on a file where it can influence more of the board. A rook that starts in the corner is limited, but once it is moved closer to the center, its power and reach grow immediately. This activation lets the rook support other pieces and control open lines without spending extra moves to get there. In a single turn, you address both your king's safety and your rook's effectiveness. After castling, players often look to coordinate their rooks, sometimes placing both on open files, or working with the queen to apply pressure along key lines. The value of castling is not only in the safety it offers, but in the way it prepares your army for the next phase of the game. Deciding when to castle is a matter of judgment, not a fixed rule. The timing depends on the balance between king safety and the need to complete development. As a general pattern, many players look to castle after their knights and bishops have been developed, but before pushing pawns too far or launching direct attacks. If you delay castling for too long, your king may remain exposed in the center, where it is more likely to become a target as the board opens up. On the other hand, castling too early, especially into a side where your pawn structure is weak or where the opponent has already begun to attack, can create new problems. Sometimes the opponent may have opened lines toward the side you intend to castle, making it risky to move your king there. In these cases, it may be better to wait, to strengthen your position, or to consider leaving the king in the center for a few more moves. There are also rare positions where castling is simply not advisable, such as when your own pieces block the rook's path, or when castling would walk into a prepared attack. The main idea is that castling is not an automatic step, but a decision that must be weighed against the specifics of the position. The position on the board, the arrangement of pawns, and the activity of both sides' pieces all shape whether castling is wise at any given moment. Thinking about castling as a blend of opportunity and responsibility changes how you approach the move. Instead of treating it as a routine step, you begin to see castling as a turning point that shapes both your king's safety and your ability to use the rook effectively. Each time you consider castling, you are balancing the need for protection with the drive for activity. This awareness brings a sense of control to your decisions, reminding you that the art of castling is not in the act itself, but in choosing the right moment. When you treat castling as a deliberate choice within your broader plan, you prepare yourself to coordinate your pieces more skillfully as the game unfolds. Chapter 6: Pawn Structures and Their Impact. The most powerful pieces on the board get most of the attention. The queen, the rooks, the bishops, and the knights all move in ways that feel decisive. But the pawns are doing something quieter, and just as important. Their arrangement shapes the entire game long before any of those pieces get to act. The queen, the rooks, the bishops, and the knights all demand attention with their sweeping moves and tactical possibilities. But beneath their action, the pawns form patterns that act as the skeleton of the position. This underlying structure is called the pawn skeleton, or pawn structure. The way pawns stand together or apart on the board determines the shape of that skeleton. These patterns are not just background details. They guide the flow of play, create opportunities, and set limits for both sides. Understanding pawn structure means seeing the board not as a collection of individual pieces, but as a landscape shaped by the paths and barriers that pawns create. The key idea here is that pawn structure does more than just fill the board. It claims space, controls key squares, and shapes every plan you make. A pawn can be the weakest unit by itself, but together, pawns set the boundaries for what pieces can do. When a pawn stands on a square, it controls the space in front of it and shields squares behind it from the opponent. This means that even a small change in pawn structure can open up new lines of attack or close off important routes. Weak pawns, such as those left alone or doubled, often become targets for attack, while strong pawn chains can form barriers that are hard to break. Recognizing these formations early helps you see which plans are likely to work and which may run into trouble. This awareness is a core skill for anyone who wants to move beyond basic tactics and begin to understand the deeper flow of a game. A common mistake is to overlook the importance of pawns, because they move slowly and can only capture diagonally. But the reality is that pawns set the stage for every major event in a game. Their position decides where battles are fought and which pieces can join the fight. When you learn to read pawn structures, you start to see the board in a new way. Instead of reacting move by move, you begin to understand why certain areas are safe or dangerous, and why certain plans are possible. This shift in focus, from individual pieces to the patterns made by pawns, marks a turning point in your growth as a player. The board becomes not just a field of action, but a map shaped by invisible borders and open roads, all drawn by the humble pawns. Pawn formations come in many shapes, but a few patterns appear again and again. The most common is the pawn chain. In a chain, pawns support each other diagonally, forming a line that is anchored by a base pawn. Each pawn in the chain covers the next, making it hard for the opponent to attack any single pawn directly. The head of the chain points forward, often aiming at the opponent's side of the board. This structure can be very solid, limiting the opponent's ability to break through the center or the wing where the chain points. But it comes with a trade-off. The base of the chain can become a target if it cannot be defended by another pawn. If the base falls, the rest of the chain can collapse quickly. Another frequent formation is the isolated pawn, This is a pawn that stands alone, with no fellow pawns on the files to its left or right. The most well-known example is the isolated queen's pawn, which sits on the D file, without support from pawns on the C or E files. An isolated pawn often gives its player more space in the center and can open lines for pieces to become active. This space advantage can lead to attacking chances, especially in the middle of the board. However, the isolated pawn itself is vulnerable. Without pawn support, it must be defended by pieces, which can tie them down and limit their freedom. Over time, this can become a weakness that the opponent targets. Doubled pawns form when two pawns of the same color end up on the same file. This usually happens after a capture. Doubled pawns are often seen as a weakness because they cannot defend each other and may block their own pieces. The front pawn can be hard to defend, and the rear pawn is stuck behind it, unable to advance. On the other hand, sometimes doubled pawns open lines for rooks or create extra control over important squares. The key is to notice when the drawbacks outweigh the benefits, and to adjust your plans accordingly. There are also structures known as phalanxes and hanging pawns. A phalanx is when two or more pawns stand side by side on the same rank, often forming a solid front. Hanging pawns are two adjacent pawns, usually on the fourth or fifth rank, that lack pawn support from behind. While hanging pawns can control a lot of space and create attacking chances, they are also at risk if forced to advance too soon. If pushed forward without support, they can leave behind holes or become isolated, giving the opponent new targets. Recognizing these formations helps you judge when to attack, when to defend, and when to maneuver for a better structure. Every pawn structure carries a set of strengths and weaknesses. The important thing is to see these patterns as living features of the board. They change as pawns move, are captured, or are advanced to create threats. Not all weaknesses can be attacked right away, and not all strengths last forever. The art is in knowing which structures favor your plan, and which ones you should try to avoid. When you learn to identify these patterns, you can begin to understand why some positions feel comfortable and others seem difficult, even before the tactics appear. The influence of pawn structure becomes most clear in the middle game. As the opening phase ends and the board opens up, the arrangement of pawns starts to decide which areas are accessible and which are closed. Central pawns, especially those on d4 and e4 or their mirror on the other side, have the greatest impact. They control the crossroads of the board and set the stage for the movement of all other pieces. When these pawns stand strong, they offer a base for launching attacks or defending key points. If they are weak, the opponent can challenge them, forcing you to defend and limiting your options. Pawn structures can block or open lines for your pieces. A closed structure, where pawn chains lock up the center, often leads to slow maneuvering and battles on the wings. An open structure, where pawns have been exchanged and the center is clear, allows pieces to move freely and creates chances for quick attacks. The arrangement of pawns can also create outposts, squares where knights or bishops can sit safely without fear of being chased away by enemy pawns. These outposts give pieces a stable base. A knight settled on an outpost, for example, can exert pressure for many moves without being chased away. A well-timed pawn break can shift the entire balance of the position. By advancing a pawn to challenge the opponent's structure, such as pushing d4 to d5 or c4 to c5, you can open files for your rooks, create new diagonals for your bishops, and shift the balance of power. The choice of when and where to break the pawn structure is one of the most important decisions in the middle game. Sometimes the right break creates a weakness in the opponent's camp, while other times it opens your own position to attack. The skill is in reading the board, seeing which break fits the structure, and weighing the risks and rewards. As you become more comfortable reading pawn structures, you start to see that they are not just obstacles or barriers. They are the framework that gives shape to every plan, every attack, and every defense. Learning to interpret these patterns gives you a kind of foresight. You start to see tension building before it erupts, and you adjust your plans before the board forces you to. Pawn structures do not just mark the landscape, they become the terrain that every piece must cross. When the pawns make sense to you, the rest of the board starts to make sense too. You stop reacting and start shaping. That is the shift pawn structure creates. Chapter 7: Mid-Game Tactics. Seize the advantage. At some point in almost every game, the quiet work of building a position gives way to something sharper. Pieces align in unexpected ways. Threats appear that were not there a move ago. This is the territory of tactics. If the opening is about laying foundations, and the pawn skeleton sets the terrain, the mid-game is where you start to look for ways to break through or disrupt your opponent's plans. The key idea here is that tactics offer a way to seize the initiative, turning small imbalances into real advantages. While strategy gives you direction, tactics are the tools that make that direction count. One of the most direct and effective tactical ideas in chess is the fork. A fork occurs when a single piece attacks two or more enemy pieces at the same time. This often forces the opponent into a difficult position, since it is rarely possible to save all the targeted pieces at once. The power of the fork lies in its ability to create a dilemma. When you threaten two important pieces, your opponent must choose which to save, often losing the other. Knights are particularly well suited to forks. Their L-shaped movement lets them reach squares that can put pressure on two or more pieces that may not be able to defend each other. But knights are not the only pieces that can create forks. Any piece, from pawns to queens, can deliver this tactic if positioned well. The effectiveness of a fork depends on timing and piece placement. If you rush to create a fork without proper support, you may find that the attacking piece can itself be captured or countered, neutralizing your threat. It is important to check whether the piece you are using for the fork is protected, and whether the opponent has a way to escape or counterattack. Sometimes a fork can target especially valuable pieces, such as in a royal fork, where the king and queen are both under threat, or a family fork, where several major pieces are attacked at once. The lesson here is that forks can quickly change the balance of power, but only if you set them up with care and avoid overlooking your opponent's resources. Another essential tactical motif in the mid-game is the pin. A pin works by freezing an opponent's piece in place because moving it would expose a more valuable piece behind it to attack. Imagine a bishop, rook, or queen lined up with two enemy pieces on the same rank, file, or diagonal. The piece in front becomes pinned, unable to move without putting the piece behind it at risk. This simple alignment can have a powerful effect. The pinned piece cannot participate freely in the rest of the battle. It may not be able to defend key squares, support an attack, or escape to safety. Pins come in two main types. An absolute pin occurs when the king is behind the pinned piece, making it illegal for that piece to move at all. A relative pin happens when a valuable piece, like a queen or rook, sits behind the pinned piece. In this case, the pinned piece can legally move, but doing so would cost material. Pins apply constant pressure and can set up further tactics, but they are not always permanent. A pin can be broken in a few ways. The opponent might sacrifice the more valuable piece and move the pinned one away. They might block the line with another piece. or they might threaten the pinning piece and force it to retreat. The strength of a pin comes from the way it ties down your opponent's forces and limits their options, often creating chances for you to build up pressure or launch a decisive attack. A closely related but distinct tactic is the skewer. While a pin immobilizes a less valuable piece to protect a more valuable one behind it, a skewer works in the opposite direction. Here you aim at a more valuable piece that stands in front, forcing it to move and reveal a less valuable piece behind it. A classic example is a rook or bishop targeting a queen that has another rook standing directly behind it. When the queen moves to safety, the rook is left exposed and can be captured. Skewers are most effective with long-range pieces like bishops, rooks, and queens, because they need a clear line along a rank, file, or diagonal. The geometry of the board matters. If other pieces block the line, the skewer cannot be set up. When a skewer works, its effect tends to be quick. By forcing a key defensive piece to move, you can break through your opponent's protection and win material. There are two main types of skewers. An absolute skewer happens when the king is in front and must move because of check, leaving the piece behind unprotected. A relative skewer targets any other valuable piece, giving your opponent a tough choice between losing material or facing other threats. The distinguishing feature of a skewer is that the front piece must move, exposing what lies behind, whereas in a pin the front piece is the one that stays put to shield what is behind. Recognizing the potential for a skewer often comes down to noticing how pieces are lined up and whether any valuable pieces are vulnerable to this kind of attack. The beauty of mid-game tactics is that they arise from the specific arrangement of pieces on the board. Forks, pins, and skewers are not abstract tricks. They are practical tools that appear in real games when you pay close attention to how your opponent's pieces are positioned and how your own pieces might work together. Timing is critical. A tactic that appears strong one move too early or too late can backfire. The opportunity for a fork can vanish if you wait too long. A pin may lose its power if the opponent finds a way to block the line or counterattack. A skewer can turn into a missed chance if the valuable piece is allowed to escape before you align your attacking piece. This is why anticipation matters. By reading the flow of the game and predicting how your opponent is likely to respond, you can set up tactical threats that are hard to parry. There is a rhythm to spotting tactics in the mid-game. It starts with scanning the board for pieces that are lined up on the same rank, file, or diagonal. You look for loose pieces that are not protected, for overloaded defenders that guard more than one important target, and for awkward arrangements that could lead to forks or skewers. The more you practice recognizing these patterns, the more natural it becomes to see tactical possibilities in the moment. Each tactic you learn becomes another tool for shaping the game, giving you the means to break through defenses, win material, or disrupt your opponent's coordination. Understanding these tactical motifs changes how you approach each move. Instead of reacting only to threats, you begin to see opportunities hidden in the arrangement of the pieces. The board becomes less about static positions and more about the potential for sudden shifts. With each fork, pin, or skewer you spot, you strengthen your ability to seize the advantage and set the terms of the battle. Once you can see these patterns, you stop reacting and start choosing. That shift changes how the whole board feels. Chapter 8: The Power of Sacrifices. A sacrifice in chess is a deliberate decision to give up material, such as a pawn or a piece, in order to gain something less obvious, but often more valuable. The key idea here is that a sacrifice is not simply a loss, it is an exchange, where you trade something tangible for a chance at a greater advantage. There are two main types of sacrifices to consider: tactical and strategic. A tactical sacrifice is usually direct and concrete. You might give up a piece with the expectation of gaining an immediate benefit, such as a forced checkmate, or a chance to win back more material in a few moves. Strategic sacrifices, on the other hand, are less about quick results and more about shaping the flow of the game over time. Here, you might give up material to open a file, activate your pieces, or weaken the enemy's structure, trusting that the benefits will unfold as the game continues. When you think about sacrifices, it helps to focus on the intent behind the move rather than the mechanics of calculation. The reason this matters is that a well-judged sacrifice often starts with a sense of what you want to achieve, not just a count of material. For example, you might sacrifice a pawn to open up a file for your rook, or a minor piece to destroy the shield around the enemy king. The moment for a sacrifice usually arrives when you see a way to shift the balance in your favor, whether by creating threats, gaining space, or exposing weaknesses in your opponent's position. What matters most is understanding the underlying goal before you commit, since a sacrifice without a clear purpose can quickly become a real loss rather than a calculated risk. A common mistake is to assume that all sacrifices are reckless or desperate. In reality, the strongest sacrifices are grounded in careful reasoning and a calm assessment of the position. Sometimes the best path to victory involves letting go of material in order to seize the initiative or to break through a stubborn defense. By approaching sacrifices with patience and clarity, you begin to see them as tools for changing the direction of the game, not as wild gambles. Each sacrifice, whether tactical or strategic, becomes a way to ask a difficult question of your opponent, forcing them to respond under new and often uncomfortable conditions. The psychological impact of a sacrifice can be just as important as its technical justification. When you sacrifice a piece, you do more than change the balance of material on the board. You also put pressure on your opponent's mind. A well-timed sacrifice can force your opponent to leave familiar ground and start calculating in positions they may not be prepared for. This shift often brings practical time pressure, especially in quick games, as your opponent must weigh multiple possibilities and defend against threats they did not expect. The sense of uncertainty that follows a sacrifice can lead to mistakes, as the defender struggles to regain footing in a suddenly altered landscape. On your side, making a sacrifice requires steady nerves. It is natural to feel doubt after giving up material, even when you have calculated carefully. Managing these emotions is part of the process. You need to trust your assessment, stay focused on your plan, and resist the urge to chase after lost material too quickly. The act of sacrificing can also change your own posture in the game, shifting you from a quiet build-up to a more aggressive and purposeful stance. This new energy can be unsettling for the opponent, who may sense the initiative slipping away. Momentum often changes hands after a sacrifice. The player who gives up material usually gains the initiative, setting the terms for the next phase of play. However, this advantage depends on the accuracy of your follow-up. If your attack loses steam, the opponent can consolidate and enjoy the benefits of extra material. The psychological weight of a sacrifice, then, is not just in the act itself, but in how both players respond. Some players, like Mikhail Tal, became famous for sacrifices that unsettled even the most experienced defenders. The lesson here is that the psychological dimension is always present, shaping the choices and reactions on both sides of the board. To see how sacrifices can lead to real strategic gains, consider a few practical scenarios. Imagine you sacrifice a knight to open lines toward the enemy king. The immediate effect is a loss of material, but the open lines allow your queen and rook to join the attack, creating sustained threats that the opponent may not be able to parry. In another situation, you might give up a pawn to open a file for your rook. Now, even though you are down a pawn, your rook becomes a powerful force, controlling the file and limiting the opponent's movements. Sometimes a bishop sacrifice on the square next to the enemy king, often h7 or h2, can break open the pawn cover, exposing the king to a wave of attacks. Even if the material count is not in your favor right away, the weakened king position can offer long-term attacking chances. A queen's sacrifice can be the most dramatic of all, but it is not always about spectacle. For example, giving up the queen to deflect a key defender can clear the way for a rook or minor piece to deliver checkmate on a back rank. There are also quieter forms of sacrifice, like exchanging a rook for a minor piece in order to place a knight on a dominant central square. While the material loss is clear, the trade-off is a position where your knight limits the opponent's rooks and controls important territory. Each of these scenarios shows that sacrifices are not about bravado. They are practical tools for gaining an edge, whether by launching an attack, opening lines, or creating weaknesses in the enemy camp. Learning to see sacrifices as part of your broader strategy shifts your focus from counting pieces to weighing possibilities. The real power of a sacrifice is not just in what you give up, but in what you stand to gain: initiative, open lines, exposed kings, or dominant pieces. When you approach sacrifices with clear intent and calm judgment, you give yourself the freedom to shape the game on your own terms, using each piece as a lever to move the balance in your favor. This mindset opens new doors in chess, turning moments of loss into opportunities for control and creativity. Chapter 9: Endgame Fundamentals. As the pieces thin out and the board grows quieter, the game enters its final phase. The endgame is a shift in atmosphere. Gone is the crowded tension of the mid-game, where threats and tactics fill every square. Now the priorities change. With fewer pieces, every move carries more weight, and each decision is measured in clarity rather than complexity. The king, once a figure to be sheltered behind walls of pawns and minor pieces, steps into the open. In these moments, understanding the new demands of the endgame becomes essential. The skills that mattered before, calculation, initiative, and tactical alertness, do not fall away, but the focus sharpens. Now, precision and patience are the keys that unlock victory. The first shift to notice is the transformation of the king. Earlier in the game, the king is tucked away, hidden from danger, and kept safe by castling and careful pawn placement. In the endgame, this changes completely. The king becomes an active piece, often the most powerful one left on the board. Its role is no longer just survival, but participation. An active king steps forward, aiming to control important squares and support the advance of pawns. The difference is striking. Where once the king avoided the center for fear of attack, now it seeks it out, using its presence to influence the flow of play. The king's nearness to its own pawns can make the difference between a pawn advancing safely or being captured. It can also restrict the opposing king, cutting off paths and limiting defensive options. At the same time, there is still a balance to be struck. Pushing the king too far ahead can expose it to checks or threats from remaining enemy pieces, especially if pawns or rooks are still in play. The discipline lies in knowing when to advance boldly and when to hold back, using the king as both a defender and an attacker. This change in the king's role is one of the defining features of endgame play. It rewards those who see the king not as a liability, but as a leader. As the king steps forward, the pawns take on new importance. The journey of a pawn is simple in its outline, but rich in possibility. Each pawn starts near its own side of the board and moves forward one square at a time toward the far rank. When a pawn crosses all 8 ranks, it is promoted. Most often, this means becoming a queen, the strongest piece available, though promoting to a rook, bishop, or knight is also possible. This transformation can change the balance of power in an instant. A single promoted pawn can outweigh all other advantages, creating threats that are impossible to ignore. The path to promotion, however, is rarely straightforward. Pawns are slow and vulnerable. They need support from the king or other pieces to avoid being captured or blockaded. A passed pawn becomes a central focus in the endgame. Creating and advancing a passed pawn often requires careful planning, sometimes sacrificing other pawns or using a majority on one side of the board to clear a path. There are moments when it is tempting to rush a pawn forward, but this can backfire if the king or other pieces are not close enough to help. One practical tool is the rule of the square. Supporting your pawn's journey and knowing when to push, when to wait, and when to use it as a distraction are all part of mastering this principle. The endgame rewards those who can turn quiet pawn moves into powerful threats. With fewer pieces, another idea comes into focus: simplification. This means exchanging pieces to clarify the position and make your advantage easier to realize. When you are ahead in material or have a positional edge, exchanging pieces can reduce the opponent's chances for counterplay. Each time a pair of pieces leaves the board, the remaining pawns and kings gain in importance. Pawns, once overlooked, become the currency of victory. Simplification is not just about trading pieces thoughtlessly. There is a judgment to be made. If you are ahead, exchanging pieces while keeping your pawns makes it easier to convert your lead. Removing pawns instead, while leaving pieces on the board, can sometimes help the opponent hold a draw, especially if your advantage is small. The fewer pieces that remain, the more every detail matters: pawn structure, king position, and even the placement of minor pieces like bishops and knights. For example, the bishop pair can be a quiet but significant asset in open positions, giving you extra reach. A knight on a blockading square can slow down a passed pawn, but it is often less reliable than a bishop or the king for this job. Simplification is about making the position manageable, reducing the chaos, and guiding the game toward a result you can control. There are times when simplifying too early, or without care, can allow the opponent to escape into a drawn ending, so the skill lies in choosing the right moment. The endgame is not a time for rushing or impatience. The moves may seem simple, but the consequences reach further than they appear. Each choice, where to place the king, when to push a pawn, whether to trade pieces, can tip the balance between victory and stalemate. What matters most is the ability to see the board with fresh eyes, to value clarity over complexity, and to trust in steady, precise play. Understanding the endgame changes how you see the whole game. The king as an active piece, the pawn as a slow but decisive threat, the exchange as a tool rather than a reflex. These ideas carry forward into everything else. The endgame is where small things become decisive. A square here. A tempo there. A pawn that reaches the far rank. That is what makes this phase worth studying carefully. Chapter 10: Advanced Endgame Techniques. In the final phase of chess, small details often matter more than raw material or flashy tactics. The ability to convert a slight edge into a win depends on understanding the subtle techniques that shape the outcome of king and pawn endgames. At this level, the focus shifts from broad plans to precise, deliberate maneuvers. Here, advanced endgame methods come into play, each offering a way to tip the balance when the board is nearly empty, and every move carries weight. The first of these techniques is opposition. Opposition is not just about moving your king forward or racing for the center. It is a specific relationship that arises when two kings stand on the same rank or file, separated by a single square. In this moment, the player who is not required to move is said to have the opposition. This status is more than symbolic. It grants the ability to control key squares. By holding the opposition, you force the other king to yield ground, often clearing a path for your pawn to advance, or for your king to enter a critical area. The simplest form is direct opposition, where the kings face off with one square between them. Recognizing this pattern matters, because the outcome of many endgames can turn on who holds the opposition at the right moment. Losing opposition by moving first can mean giving away control of a vital queening square. The visual cue is straightforward. Two kings face each other with one square between them, and the side that is not required to move holds the advantage. This is not the same as general king activity, where both sides simply try to get closer to the action. Opposition is about forcing your opponent's king to step aside, creating a moment of leverage that can decide the game. In practical terms, the king that claims the right moment to hold the opposition can shepherd a pawn forward, block the rival king, or secure a draw from a difficult position. In this way, opposition becomes a quiet weapon, one that works not by force but by timing. Building on this, another technique that shapes advanced endgames is zugzwang. Zugzwang is a situation where the obligation to move becomes a disadvantage. In a typical zugzwang position, a player would prefer to pass, but chess does not allow this. Every move has consequences, and sometimes the only available choices weaken the position. In king and pawn endgames, zugzwang often appears when both kings are near a crucial pawn, and the defender is forced to step away from a key square. When this happens, the attacker can seize the opportunity to advance a pawn or invade an important area. The underlying logic is simple. By restricting your opponent's king to just a few squares, you create a scenario where every move they make gives you an advantage. This is not limited to rare or exotic positions. Many basic king and pawn endings reach a point where one side has no good moves left, and the game turns on this single detail. The effect on the player experiencing it can be disorienting. Every legal move makes the position worse, and there is nothing to be done about it. Zugzwang transforms what might have been a draw into a win. It is a reminder that in the endgame, the act of moving itself can be a liability when the position is tight and options are few. The practical lesson from zugzwang is to look for ways to restrict the opponent, not just to gain space, but to limit their options until every move they make costs them something. Closely linked to both opposition and zugzwang is the technique of triangulation. Triangulation is an intentional way to waste a move with your king, so that you hand the move over to your opponent in a position where it matters. The method is elegant. The king moves along a triangular path, usually touching 3 squares, and returns to its original spot, but now it is the other side's turn to move. This shift in the move order is often all that is needed to gain the opposition or to push the opponent into zugzwang. Triangulation tends to be most effective when the kings are locked in a standoff and neither side can afford to move first. By maneuvering along a triangle, often spanning 2 files and 1 rank, the attacking king can force the defender to step away or give up control of a critical square. This is not just simple shuffling. The key is in the timing and the specific pattern. The defender, especially if confined near the edge or blocked by pawns, cannot always copy the maneuver. This gives the attacker a unique way to control the tempo of the endgame. Triangulation is a step beyond basic king maneuvering. It requires the player to see not only the immediate position, but also how the sequence of moves will unfold. When used at the right moment, triangulation can convert a position that seems balanced into one where the attacker holds the decisive advantage by shifting the burden of the next move to the defender. What connects opposition, zugzwang, and triangulation is not the moves themselves. It is the idea that timing can be a weapon. In most phases of chess, a good move gains something. In the endgame, the right move can force the opponent into a position where every move they make loses something. That shift in thinking is what these techniques point toward. The board does not get simpler as pieces come off. In some ways it gets harder because the margin for error shrinks and the consequences of each decision grow. Seeing that is what separates a player who survives the endgame from one who controls it. Chapter 11. The Psychological Game. The mental landscape of chess stretches far beyond the patterns of moves and the calculation of variations. At the highest levels, chess becomes a meeting point of minds, where the psychological game often decides what the pieces alone cannot. Every player carries a unique set of feelings, habits, and reactions to the board. This unseen layer shapes every decision, sometimes as powerfully as any tactic or positional idea. To recognize its role, it helps to look at how players read each other and themselves, searching for quiet signals that hint at deeper intentions. One way players gather insight is by watching their opponent at the board. Body language, in this context, means the subtle ways someone sits, glances, or adjusts their posture. An upright, steady pose can suggest comfort, while fidgeting or shifting may hint at uncertainty. These signals are indirect. A player may stretch to stay alert, or lean back to think, not necessarily because of the position. The key is to observe without leaping to conclusions. Body language offers a possible clue, not a verdict. A calm observer notes patterns over time, letting experience filter what matters and what does not. Another signal comes from move timing. When a player spends a long time on a move, it could mean they are working through a complex calculation, or it might be a sign that the position is new or uncomfortable for them. Quick moves sometimes show confidence or familiarity, but they can also mask nerves or be used as a deliberate strategy to appear unfazed. Experienced players sometimes vary their thinking time on purpose, hoping to give away as little information as possible. The lesson here is to treat timing clues as part of a broader picture, not as a simple tell. Many factors influence how quickly or slowly someone moves. Patterns in play offer a different kind of window into the mind. Many players have favorite openings or recurring middle game plans. Noticing these habits can help you anticipate their choices and prepare countermeasures. If your opponent repeatedly chooses the same setup, it may signal where they feel most at home. Over time, you learn to recognize the comfort zones and the moments when someone steps outside them. Still, it is important to remember that even a familiar pattern can be broken. Assumptions should remain flexible, allowing room for surprise. Throughout this process, the goal is to observe with a neutral eye. Chess rules prohibit distracting or disturbing your opponent, and fair play is central to the spirit of the game. Reading an opponent is not about seeking weakness to exploit unfairly, but about understanding the full context in which decisions are made. With practice, these observations become part of your natural awareness, blending into your overall preparation. Over time, you become less reactive and more attuned to the quiet flow of the game, learning to trust subtle impressions without being led astray by them. During play, some degree of stress is common. For many players, the mind races, the heart beats a little faster, and each move feels like it carries weight. Instead of trying to eliminate stress, many players learn to manage it. One practical approach is deep breathing. By focusing on slow, steady breaths, you help settle your heart rate and ease the sense of urgency that builds under pressure. This creates a small pocket of stillness, giving you space to think clearly, even in tense moments. The effect is not to erase nerves, but to keep them from taking over. Visualization is another tool. Before a move, you might imagine yourself acting with calm focus, seeing the board as a place of clarity rather than chaos. This mental picture supports concentration. It helps you return to the present moment, especially after a mistake or setback. Some players use a short, consistent routine before each move, such as pausing for a breath or briefly scanning the board in a set order. These rituals are not about superstition, but about creating familiarity and steadiness in the face of uncertainty. Maintaining a positive mindset is a third technique. Chess can be unforgiving, and mistakes are part of every game. The important shift is to see errors as temporary, not as a sign that the game is lost or that your thinking is flawed beyond repair. Self-talk can help here, quietly reminding yourself that setbacks are part of learning, or that there is always another move to make. Even in a tournament setting, where time is limited and the pressure is real, brief moments of mental reset can make a difference. The goal is not to escape stress, but to meet it with enough composure to make thoughtful decisions. The influence of psychological factors on chess runs deep, shaping the flow of play in subtle ways. Pressure, whether from the clock, the opponent, or the stakes of the game, often narrows the field of choices. Some players become cautious, afraid to take risks. Others swing the opposite way, chasing complications in search of relief. Confidence and expectation color every calculation, sometimes causing us to overlook threats or misjudge opportunities. The mind state frames what we see and how we respond. Awareness becomes a guiding tool. By noticing your own mindset, you can catch yourself leaning toward rushed or impulsive moves. When you sense pressure mounting, it is possible to take a step back, breathe, and reconsider. The same awareness applies to your opponent. If you recognize signs that they are unsettled or under strain, you might choose moves that quietly increase that pressure without overreaching. Sometimes, psychological tension opens doors. A player who feels cornered may make a hasty blunder, or one who senses a shift in momentum may hesitate at a critical moment. The psychological game does not replace calculation or strategy, but it shapes the conditions in which both unfold. It is an invisible current that runs beneath every move, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong. When you learn to watch for these currents, in yourself and your opponent, you gain another dimension of control. The pieces stay the same. The rules stay the same. What changes is the layer of attention you bring to both sides of the board, including your own. That shift does not make the game easier. It makes it clearer. Chapter 12. Recognizing patterns. Pattern recognition in chess is the quiet art of seeing the familiar in the midst of complexity. At its core, this skill is about noticing when the arrangement of pieces or the shape of the pawns reminds you of something you have seen before. Instead of viewing each position as entirely new, experienced players build a mental library of shapes and setups. These recurring board configurations can be as simple as a pawn structure or as complex as a coordinated group of pieces aimed at a common goal. Recognizing these patterns is not about memorizing long lists of positions, but about developing a habit of attention. You begin to spot similarities between games, even when the surface details change. This is what separates surface observation from deeper understanding. When a position feels familiar, your mind begins to recall the plans and ideas that tend to belong to that shape. Certain pawn structures point toward specific strategies. Clusters of pieces can signal tactical possibilities. The ability to read these cues quickly lets you move past step-by-step calculation and draw on what you have seen before. Over time, this builds a framework for making sense of what is happening on the board. While time pressure or limited experience can make this process harder, the habit itself grows stronger each time you pause to notice and reflect on what you see. As you build this skill, the practical benefits become clear during play. Imagine sitting at the board and facing a common setup, such as a weak pawn left behind, or a king with little protection. If you have seen these situations before, you are more likely to know what to do. Recognizing a familiar tactical motif allows you to act with greater confidence. You recall that certain moves often work well in these situations, and you can draw on those memories to guide your next step. This does not mean you should rely on automatic responses. Chess positions that look alike can hide important differences. The best players use pattern recognition as a starting point, and then check whether the details match the pattern they remember. This approach helps reduce uncertainty. Instead of searching for a move in a vacuum, you narrow your focus to plans that have worked in similar situations. You become more efficient, making decisions with less hesitation. For less experienced players, there is a tendency to apply patterns too rigidly, missing subtle changes that call for a different approach. With practice, you learn to balance recognition with careful checking. Pattern recognition is not just for grandmasters or advanced players. It is a skill that grows with every game, every puzzle, every moment you stop to ask, "What does this remind me of?" The more you practice, the more you see, and the easier it becomes to trust your instincts while still respecting the unique features of each position. Beyond immediate move selection, pattern recognition shapes how you prepare for what comes next. Chess is not only about responding to the present, but about anticipating the future. When you recognize a pattern, you start to predict what your opponent might do. If a familiar pawn structure points toward a certain type of attack, you can begin to prepare defenses or counterattacks before those threats even appear. This shift from reacting to planning is a quiet turning point in a player's growth. You move from being surprised by threats to quietly expecting them, and sometimes even setting subtle traps of your own. The ability to anticipate based on patterns does not mean you always know exactly what will happen. Sometimes positions that look familiar contain hidden surprises. A pawn may be one square further, or a piece may be slightly misplaced, changing the outcome. Some opponents avoid familiar setups intentionally, which can make their plans harder to anticipate. Even so, the habit of looking forward, of using previous experience to inform your expectations, is what allows you to form multi-move plans. You begin to think not just about your next move, but about the likely sequence of moves that will follow. This kind of foresight is not a guarantee, but it is a tool that helps you play with greater purpose and calm. As you continue to build your awareness of patterns, the board itself starts to feel more transparent. What once felt like a tangle of options starts to feel more navigable. Each pattern you recognize points you toward plans that fit the situation. This way of seeing does not replace calculation or creativity, but it gives you a strong foundation. With each game, your sense of what belongs and what stands out grows sharper. Over time, this way of seeing changes more than your speed. Chess starts to feel less like a sequence of moves to recall, and more like a shape you are learning to read. Chapter 13. Common mistakes to avoid. There are a handful of mistakes that show up again and again, across players at every level. Not because people are careless, but because learning to juggle new plans and ideas takes time. The goal is not to stop making mistakes. It is to notice them sooner. These errors rarely come from a lack of effort. More often, they are a natural part of learning to juggle new ideas and plans. The key is not to avoid mistakes entirely, but to learn to spot them as soon as possible. This awareness, especially in the middle of a game, can mean the difference between steady progress and feeling stuck. One of the most common missteps in early play is neglecting to develop your pieces efficiently. It is easy to get caught up in moving pawns or advancing one favorite piece again and again, but this slows your overall progress. When you do not bring out your knights and bishops early, your opponent can quickly seize control of the center. This gives them more space to maneuver, while your own pieces remain stuck at home, unable to help. The board starts to feel cramped, and your options shrink. Another frequent issue is moving the same piece several times in the opening. Each time you do this, you lose what is called tempo. In chess, tempo refers to a unit of time in chess, roughly equal to one move. Losing tempo means spending a move on something that does not improve your position, while your opponent uses their moves to develop and prepare. If you keep moving one piece while your opponent develops several, you fall behind in readiness. Your position may look safe, but you are not prepared for the challenges that follow. The pieces that remain undeveloped cannot join in attack or defense, leaving your plans one step slower than your opponent's. Some players focus so much on keeping their king safe that they forget the rest of the board. It is true that leaving the king in the center for too long creates risks. Yet if you spend all your moves building walls of pawns or shifting pieces just to shield the king, you may never get your other pieces out. This can make your position passive. Your opponent gains the freedom to shape the game, while you are left reacting to threats instead of guiding the play. The balance between safety and activity is delicate, and leaning too far to one side often leads to trouble. There is also the risk of ignoring threats from your opponent while you work on your own plans. It is tempting to press forward with development, or a favorite strategy, but failing to notice when a piece is under attack can cost you material. A single oversight can quickly offset several good moves. The habit to build is to pause and ask what your opponent is aiming for before you continue with your own idea. This step is simple, but it protects against the most basic traps. A different kind of mistake appears when a player becomes too focused on one part of the board or one plan. This is often called tunnel vision. It happens when you are so invested in an attack or a defensive idea that you stop noticing what else is happening. For example, you might line up all your pieces to attack on the king side, believing you are close to victory. If you do not check whether the attack is actually working, you may waste moves and leave the rest of the board undefended. Meanwhile, your opponent can counterattack in another area, often with greater effect. Tunnel vision is not limited to attacks. Sometimes a player pours all their attention into defending a threatened piece, or chasing a tactical trick, and loses sight of the broader position. In doing so, they may overlook a bigger threat or a chance to improve another piece. Seeing the whole board tends to reward you with better options. Asking yourself, what would my opponent play here, before each move is a practical way to step back and broaden your view. This habit helps you avoid blunders and spot opportunities that single-minded focus might miss. Bringing awareness to your own patterns of thinking is a skill that grows with practice. Rather than seeing tunnel vision as a flaw, treat it as a signal that your attention has narrowed. Each time you notice it, you have a chance to pause, scan the board, and adjust your plans. This simple act of stepping back can transform your approach, making each move part of a larger conversation between your ideas and your opponents. After a game finishes, the learning does not stop. The process of self-analysis turns mistakes from sources of frustration into tools for growth. Self-analysis simply means taking time to review your moves, one by one, and asking what worked and what did not. Writing down your opponent's moves and asking why they chose each one can reveal threats you missed or patterns you have not yet recognized. This habit builds your ability to spot danger and opportunity in future games. One effective method is to look for the piece in your own position that was least active or most awkward. Ask yourself how you might have improved its role. This teaches you to strengthen your position step by step, rather than hoping for a single brilliant move. Some players use chess engines to highlight tactical errors, while others compare their moves to those played in similar positions by more experienced players. Both methods can help you see where you tend to go wrong, especially if the same types of mistakes appear in different games. It can also help to make a list of moves you considered during the game but did not play. Looking back, check if you overlooked any checks, captures, or major threats that could have changed the outcome. This simple review sharpens your tactical awareness and makes blunders less likely over time. The point is not to dwell on errors, but to treat each one as a clue to how you can think more clearly in the future. With each game you review, the same types of mistakes become easier to spot before they happen. That is the point of looking back. Not to dwell on what went wrong, but to make the next game a little clearer than the last. Chapter 14. Adapting to different playstyles. Not every opponent plays the same game. Some push forward from the first move, looking for confrontation. Others pull back, build slowly, and wait. The difference matters, because the same plan that works against one type of player can fall apart against another. While no two players are exactly alike, it helps to notice that most styles fall into three broad categories: aggressive, defensive, and balanced. An aggressive style is marked by bold moves and constant threats. These players create pressure, pushing their pieces forward to challenge and unsettle. They look for ways to force you into a defensive posture, often prioritizing dynamic possibilities over long-term stability. Defensive players, by contrast, build solid positions and focus on safety. They avoid unnecessary risks, protect their pieces carefully, and prefer to wait for mistakes rather than create complications. Their moves reinforce the structure around their king, and they are slow to commit to attacks. Between these two extremes lies the balanced style. Balanced players mix active plans with caution, switching between aggression and defense as the position requires. They value flexibility, aiming to keep their options open rather than following a single path. It is important to remember that these categories are not strict labels. Many players blend elements from all three, shifting their approach as the game changes. The real value in noticing play styles is not to judge or limit an opponent, but to orient yourself and prepare for the patterns you are likely to face. By learning to recognize the difference between these styles, you begin to see the game through a wider lens. This perspective makes it easier to adjust your plans and respond with confidence, rather than being caught off guard by an unfamiliar approach. The first step in adapting to a new opponent is observation. Early in the game, careful attention to your opponent's moves can reveal a great deal about their intentions. If you see them advancing pawns quickly and bringing pieces forward at every opportunity, it may signal an aggressive mindset. These players often look for ways to unsettle the balance and create threats before you have finished developing. On the other hand, if your opponent seems to focus on protecting their own pieces, reinforcing their pawn structure, and avoiding exchanges, they are likely leaning toward a defensive approach. Balanced players may split the difference, developing pieces efficiently and keeping their kings safe, while not rushing into either attack or retreat. A practical way to sharpen your observation is to ask yourself after each move, what is my opponent trying to do? This habit helps you spot patterns, like repeated threats or a steady buildup of defensive moves. It is also useful to watch for whether your opponent leaves pieces unprotected or creates weaknesses. Sometimes this means they are willing to take risks for the sake of an attack, but at other times it simply shows inexperience or oversight. Over time, You learn to distinguish between intentional gambles and accidental mistakes. Another indicator is whether your opponent follows established opening principles or invents their own path. Players who deviate early may be relying on intuition or testing your ability to adapt. The main idea here is to look for repeated tendencies, not to draw conclusions from a single move. Play styles often become clearer as the opening gives way to the middle game, so patience and ongoing assessment are key. Once you have a sense of your opponent's style, the next step is to adapt your own strategy. Against aggressive players, one reliable response is to anticipate their threats before they fully develop. This is prophylactic thinking in action. You spot where the attack is headed and make a quiet move to cut it off before it arrives. If you can blunt their momentum, aggressive players can struggle to regroup or find a new plan. When facing defensive players, the challenge is different. Here the goal is to create small weaknesses in their position, then gradually increase the pressure. You might look for ways to provoke pawn moves that leave gaps, or to control open lines that force their pieces into passive roles. Defensive opponents are patient by nature. But steady, targeted pressure changes that. Over time it can force small concessions, open a file or push them into a position they did not want to defend. When you meet a balanced player, flexibility becomes your greatest tool. Adapting in real time, switching between attack and defense as needed, helps you avoid falling into predictable patterns. It is also helpful to mix up your own style, keeping your opponent uncertain about your next move. This prevents them from settling into a comfortable counter strategy. Regardless of the style you face, active piece placement remains important. Moves that challenge your opponent and limit their options tend to keep you in control, but the right level of activity depends on the specific position. Adapting your play does not mean abandoning your principles. Instead, it is about adjusting your focus, using your understanding of pawn structures and candidate moves to guide your decisions. Adapting your play is not a separate skill you apply on top of chess. It is what chess asks of you in every game. The player who can read a position, recognize what kind of game they are in, and shift their approach accordingly is not reacting to their opponent. They are staying one step ahead. That is what makes style awareness useful. Not as a way to label people, but as a way to see more clearly what the position is asking for. Chapter 15: Mastering Time Control. In chess, time is more than a number ticking down on the clock. It is a resource, as real and as limited as your pieces on the board. Every move you make uses a little of it, and once spent, you cannot reclaim it. Time management in chess is simply the art of deciding how much of that resource to invest in each position. The key idea here is to find a balance. Play quickly enough to avoid trouble with the clock, yet carefully enough to avoid careless mistakes. Rushing through moves can leave you exposed to simple blunders, while overthinking can rob you of the minutes you need for complex moments later. Each player has a natural rhythm, a pace at which they think clearly and act with purpose. The goal is to tune into this rhythm, adjusting it as the position demands. A common assumption is that time management only matters at higher levels of play. In reality, even at the beginner level, poor time choices can spoil good positions or turn small advantages into losses. What matters most is learning to weigh the cost of each minute against the value of a better move. As you become more aware of this trade-off, the clock becomes not just a measure of pressure, but a tool for shaping your decisions. The psychological effects of time pressure are hard to ignore. When the clock runs low, your mind can race, and familiar positions may suddenly seem foreign. A single unexpected move from your opponent, or a blunder of your own, can send a wave of panic through your thinking. This is when composure becomes a real asset. Staying calm under time pressure may feel out of reach at first, but it is a skill that tends to develop with practice. One practical method is to use controlled breathing. When you notice your heart rate rising or your thoughts scattering, pause for a moment and take a slow, deep breath. This simple act can reset your focus and slow the rush of anxious decisions. Another technique is to establish a short pre-game routine. This might mean quietly going over the first few moves you expect to see, or picturing the kind of position you are likely to reach early on. Such habits anchor you, making the start of the game feel familiar and steady. During play, get in the habit of pausing briefly after your opponent moves. Ask yourself, what is their threat? Is anything unprotected? This structured check-in interrupts rash decisions and gives your mind a foothold when the clock is short. After the game, looking back at your moves can help you spot which moments tend to trigger stress and where your time trouble usually begins. Over time, these habits make it more likely that you will keep your composure, even when every second counts. Improving your decision-making speed without giving up accuracy is a process that can be practiced. One way to do this is by setting up games with different time controls. Play some games where you must move quickly, then others where you have more time to think. Notice how your choices change as the clock ticks down. This helps you learn how much time you actually need to spot threats, consider responses, and make solid moves. Another useful exercise is to simulate time pressure. Set a timer for each move, giving yourself less time than you are comfortable with. The goal is not to rush, but to practice thinking clearly when the clock is loud in your ear. As you do this, try following a simple checklist. Does my move check, capture, or create a threat? Are my pieces protected? Do I see any tactics like forks or pins? This routine builds a mental habit that speeds up your thinking without skipping steps. After each session, review your decisions. Track where you moved too fast and missed something, or where you hesitated and ran out of time. This reflection turns mistakes into lessons, making you less likely to repeat them. It is important to recognize that progress comes from steady, regular practice, not from expecting overnight results. With regular practice, most players find that both their speed and accuracy gradually improve, and the clock starts to feel less like a threat. When you approach time management as a skill to be refined, not a barrier to be feared, the chessboard opens up in new ways. The clock becomes part of your strategy, shaping not only how you play, but how you think and respond under pressure. Each game becomes a chance to tune your internal rhythm, build composure, and sharpen your decisions. Over time, the relationship between the moves you choose and the time you spend on them grows clearer. This awareness allows you to navigate the demands of tournament play with greater confidence, ready for the moments when the position narrows and the cost of each second becomes clear. Chapter 16: The Role of Technology in Chess. The way chess is learned and played looks very different today than it did just a few decades ago. One of the most significant changes has come through the rise of chess engines. These tools can examine millions of possible move sequences in seconds, and their evaluations are precise enough that even the strongest human players cannot consistently match them. The result is a level of accuracy and consistency that even the strongest human players cannot match. For everyday players, this means that reviewing a game with a chess engine can reveal mistakes and missed opportunities that might otherwise go unnoticed. The key idea here is that chess engines are not reserved for elite players. They are widely available and commonly used at all levels, helping anyone who wants to deepen their understanding of the game. By making complex positions clearer and more accessible, engines have changed how players of all backgrounds approach study and preparation. The impact of chess engines goes beyond simply pointing out tactical errors. Tools like Stockfish and Leela Chess Zero go well beyond catching tactical errors. They are used to analyze opening theory, study endgame techniques, and evaluate critical positions at a level of depth that was once unavailable to most players. When players review games with these tools, they gain insight into why certain moves succeed or fail. However, while chess engines excel at calculation, they do not always explain their reasoning in ways that are easy for humans to grasp. Their evaluations are based on calculation depth rather than intuition or practical experience. This means that while an engine might recommend a move as best, the logic behind it can remain hidden unless a player takes time to explore the position more deeply. Still, the practical benefit is clear. Engines open the door to understanding positions that once seemed beyond reach, making high-level analysis a routine part of improvement for players everywhere. Alongside engines, online chess platforms have transformed how people access and experience the game. These platforms connect players from around the world, offering real-time matches, correspondence games, and a wide range of learning resources. Major sites such as chess.com and Lichess provide features like matchmaking, puzzles, analysis tools, tournaments, and structured lessons. The result is a chess environment that is both accessible and highly competitive. Players can find opponents of similar skill levels at any hour, thanks to rating systems that pair users within a defined range. This global reach means that age, nationality, and location are no longer barriers to finding a good game. The diversity of opponents and styles encountered online encourages steady growth and adaptability. Learning on these platforms is not limited to playing games. Interactive puzzle training, post-game analysis, video lessons from titled players, and built-in coaches all support ongoing improvement. These tools help players identify recurring mistakes and provide targeted feedback. For many, this means that the learning process is no longer isolated or dependent on in-person clubs and books. Instead, improvement happens in real time with immediate feedback and support from a worldwide community. Online chess is sometimes seen as less serious than sitting across from someone at a physical board. But the competitive environment these platforms create is real. Rated tournaments, leaderboards, and structured leagues bring the same pressure and focus as any in-person event. Regular tournaments, leaderboards, and achievement systems add an extra layer of motivation, making the pursuit of progress both structured and engaging. The most profound shift comes from the way human intuition and machine calculation now work together. Instead of viewing technology as a replacement for traditional skills, many players now see it as a partner in growth. Human intuition brings pattern recognition, creativity, and a sense of practical judgment to the table. Chess engines and online tools provide calculation, consistency, and a wealth of data. When these strengths are combined, the result is a powerful synergy that accelerates learning and deepens understanding. Evidence from practice suggests that players who combine their own analysis with engine feedback tend to notice tactical errors and positional misconceptions more quickly. Over time, this process strengthens pattern recognition and strategic insight. Interactive features such as move evaluation, blunder detection, and suggested alternatives make this synergy tangible. When a player reviews a game and sees not just the best move, but also an explanation of why their chosen move faltered, improvement becomes more active and less passive. Technology enables a cycle of trial, feedback, and adjustment. That cycle is what makes progress stick. It is tempting to think that leaning on engines might dull creativity. But many players find the opposite happens. Technology helps reveal the deeper layers of strategy, encouraging players to explore, experiment, and question their assumptions. The challenge remains to translate machine evaluations into meaningful insight, but the tools themselves invite a more engaged and thoughtful approach. The landscape of chess continues to expand as technology breaks down barriers and brings new dimensions to strategy and learning. The integration of engines and online platforms has not replaced the human element, it has sharpened it. The process of discovery is now a shared effort between calculation and intuition, data and imagination. This partnership invites players to approach the game with curiosity and openness, ready to explore new methods and deeper insights. The board has not changed. What has changed is what players bring to it, and what they have access to when they step away. Chapter 17. Crafting a Personal Study Plan. Most chess improvement happens by accident. You play a game, feel frustrated, look something up, move on. A study plan changes that. It turns scattered effort into directed practice, and it starts with a single question: what do you actually want to get better at? The first step is to set clear, realistic goals. This process is less about ambition and more about clarity. Ask yourself what you hope to accomplish with your chess. Do you want to reach a certain rating, master a specific opening, or simply play with more confidence? The key here is to make each goal specific and achievable, so you always know what you are working toward. If you are under 1600, foundational goals like sharpening your tactical vision and learning one opening as white and one as black offer a strong starting point. If you are between 1600 and 1900, it makes sense to broaden your focus, adding more opening knowledge, building positional understanding, and beginning to study endgames. Goals should fit your current level, not someone else's expectations. Once you have an idea of where you want to go, the next step is honest self-assessment. This means taking a calm, unhurried look at your recent games, not just the wins and losses, but the decisions behind them. Notice where you excel. Perhaps you spot tactics quickly, or maybe you maintain good piece coordination in the opening. Equally important is to pinpoint your weaknesses. Do you miss simple forks, or struggle to convert small advantages in the endgame? One method that helps is to pause during your own games and ask why your opponent made each move, or to check each position for unprotected pieces and forcing moves before you respond. This kind of reflection is not something you do once. As you improve, your strengths and weaknesses shift. What was a weakness 6 months ago may no longer need attention. Checking in regularly keeps your goals pointed at what actually needs work. With your abilities mapped out and your goals set, you can begin to explore the wide range of resources available for learning chess. Books remain a steady source of deep understanding, offering detailed explanations and examples. Some players prefer the structure of online courses, which often break down concepts into manageable lessons with interactive exercises. Community forums and discussion groups bring opportunities to ask questions, share insights, and learn from others' experiences. What matters most is matching the resource to your learning style and your goals. If you learn best by reading, a well-chosen book on tactics or openings can anchor your study. If you prefer visual learning, digital courses or annotated game videos may suit you better. Community interaction is especially useful when you want feedback or when you struggle to stay motivated alone. There is no need to rush. Take time to sample different formats and choose only those that help you move toward your specific objectives. The quality of a resource is often more important than its quantity. For example, revisiting core tactical patterns benefits players at every level, while opening books that focus on the most played moves and their ideas are more useful than dense theory lists. As you progress, studying pawn structures and their typical plans becomes valuable, especially when you reach the mid-levels. For those who use digital tools, engine analysis can show you where your thinking went wrong and why a different move would have been stronger. Each resource has strengths and limitations. Books reward patience, but do not push back. Online platforms move faster and adapt to your pace, but that flexibility can make it easy to skim past the harder ideas. Knowing which you need at a given moment is part of building a plan that actually works. With your goals defined and your resources chosen, the next step is to build a practice routine that gives structure to your improvement. The most effective routines combine two main elements: study and application. Theoretical study means reading about chess ideas, solving tactical puzzles, or reviewing annotated games. Practical application means playing games, whether online or in person, and then analyzing them afterward. Alternating between these modes helps you internalize concepts and test them in real situations. Consistency tends to produce more steady progress than occasional long sessions. For most players, shorter sessions spread across the week tend to build more lasting habits than occasional long ones. Tracking your progress is a quiet but important part of this routine. Simple methods work best. You might keep a journal to note what you worked on each week and how you felt about your games. Some players use progress charts to track rating changes or record the number of tactical errors found in post-game analysis. These habits make your growth visible and help you notice patterns over time. When you see an area improving, it reinforces your effort. When setbacks appear, you can adjust your plan without discouragement. Motivation rises and falls, but a well-designed study plan helps smooth these cycles. Occasionally playing against stronger opponents can give you valuable feedback and highlight areas for future improvement. But it is wise to mix these challenges with games against players of similar skill, to keep learning steady and maintain enjoyment. Setbacks are natural. They are signs that you are stretching your skills, not that you are failing. Each review, each adjustment, is a step forward. The act of crafting your own study plan changes your relationship with chess. Instead of drifting between resources or reacting to each loss with frustration, you become a steady guide for your own progress. Each goal set, each practice session completed, builds both skill and confidence. The process is not about chasing quick results, but about learning to direct your own improvement with care and intention. Over time, the routine becomes its own reward, revealing the deeper satisfaction of growth that is both measured and meaningful. This way of learning prepares you to make the most of every resource, every game, and every new idea that the world of chess has to offer. Chapter 18: Embracing Continuous Learning. Continuous learning in chess is not a task to be finished, but a habit of mind that turns each game into a step forward. The key idea is that every game, whether it ends in victory or defeat, contains lessons waiting to be uncovered. When you approach chess with this outlook, the result of the game becomes less important than what you can take from it. Each move, each position, and each choice made on the board offers a chance to better understand your thinking, your habits, and your growth as a player. The process of reflecting after a game, whether by reviewing your moves, asking why your opponent played a certain way, or using chess software to analyze key moments, reveals patterns in your decisions. These patterns point to both strengths to build on and weaknesses to address. Mistakes, far from being setbacks, become guideposts that show where you can improve. Even in games that feel one-sided, there are often overlooked tactical ideas or positional themes that, when studied, help prevent similar errors in the future. Many players find that discussing games with others or reviewing critical moments with a chess engine uncovers insights they missed during play. The important shift is letting go of the need for perfection and instead valuing each experience for what it can teach. When you see both wins and losses as parts of the same journey, the pressure to always succeed gives way to a steadier, more curious approach to improvement. This mindset turns the chessboard into a classroom, where every outcome has something new to offer. Adaptation is the companion of continuous learning. In chess, no two games unfold in quite the same way, and each opponent brings their own ideas, habits, and surprises. The ability to adjust your plans as the game unfolds is what allows steady progress. Sometimes, a move from your opponent will challenge your expectations, forcing you to regroup a piece or shift your strategy. For example, an unexpected pawn advance or a sharp tactical threat can make your original plan less effective. The habit of adaptation means staying alert to these changes and responding with flexibility rather than frustration. You might need to reposition a knight to a more active square, or change your focus from one area of the board to another. Sometimes, the structure of the pawns demands a new approach, as different openings create different landscapes for your pieces to navigate. The willingness to mix up your own play, to try new openings or vary your strategy, also keeps your opponents from predicting your choices. Adaptation is not just about reacting to threats, but about seeing the whole board and adjusting your aims as new possibilities appear. Many stronger players develop this habit by looking beyond immediate threats, building plans that can shift as the position changes. The idea is to treat each new situation as an invitation to think creatively, rather than a problem to be solved with the same old answers. When you see the board as a living, changing space, you become less attached to fixed routines and more comfortable with the flow of the game. Embracing a growth mindset is what ties together the habits of learning and adaptation. When you hold that belief, the challenges of chess stop feeling like obstacles and start feeling like material to work with. In chess, this means treating every challenge, whether it is a tough opponent, a confusing position, or a disappointing result, as a chance to learn something new. Instead of measuring progress only by rating or results, you begin to value the process of discovery. Each difficult game becomes a source of data, not a verdict on your skill. This way of thinking makes the journey of chess more rewarding, because it opens up endless possibilities for improvement. Many dedicated learners study the games of top players. Not to copy every move, but to see how mastery is built through exposure to fresh ideas and regular testing against strong opposition. Regularly seeking out players who challenge you and reflecting on their strategies reinforces the idea that growth is ongoing. There is no final summit in chess. There are always new heights to reach. This perspective turns setbacks into stepping stones and makes each playing session, each puzzle, and each analysis session part of a larger story of development. The reward is not just in reaching a higher level, but in enjoying the process of getting there. Seeing chess as a lifelong practice shifts your relationship with the game. It becomes less about proving yourself and more about exploring what is possible each time you sit down at the board. The habits of reflection, adaptation, and curiosity become tools you can use both in chess and beyond it. The board becomes a kind of mirror for your thinking, your patience, and your willingness to grow. With this mindset, every move is an invitation to learn, every game a chapter in a longer story. Mastery stops being a single moment of arrival. It becomes something that keeps unfolding, shaped by every lesson you gather along the way. Chess is never finished. It is always waiting to show you something new.